Princess Catherine of Wales just stunned the entire United Kingdom by finally shattering 17 months of suffocating palace silence, breaking a sacred vow of institutional secrecy she had been forced to swear the very night her youngest son first collapsed in the private nursery corridor of Adelaide Cottage. In a devastating handwritten statement released without warning at 7 minutes past 9 o'clock this morning, the Princess of Wales, long cast by the world as the composed guardian of a fragile monarchy, the loyal daughter-in-law who never strayed from protocol, the mother who smiled through every private agony, has finally spoken the words the men in grey inside Kensington Palace had spent nearly 2 years ensuring would never see the light of day. She named the illness. She named the fear. She named in her own trembling ink the boy at the center of it all, her Louis, her youngest, her spirited little prince, and in doing so she has done something no royal mother has dared to do in a generation. She has torn open the curtain the palace machinery had so carefully drawn around a sick child. What exactly did Catherine reveal in that cream-colored, hand-folded letter that has left senior courtiers scrambling in the corridors of Buckingham Palace? Why did the ruthless apparatus of the firm explicitly forbid her, in writing, from ever confirming the true nature of Prince Louis's condition to the British public? And what dark, hidden tragedy inside the nursery walls of Adelaide Cottage finally compelled the Princess of Wales to defy the crown, defy the institution, and defy the very oath she had signed in the cold grey light of a January dawn 17 months ago? The morning had begun quietly at Adelaide Cottage, the sort of pale, frost-touched Berkshire morning that seemed to belong to another century entirely. A biting November wind moved across the manicured lawns of Windsor Great Park, rattling the last stubborn leaves from the ancient oaks that had stood sentinel over the royal grounds since the reign of George III. Inside the cottage, the drawing room lay hushed and cavernous, its tall mullioned windows fogged with the breath of a house that had spent too many months holding its own. A single lamp burned on the mahogany writing desk that had once belonged to Queen Mary, its brass fittings tarnished by decades of quiet correspondence, its leather blotter creased with the faint impressions of letters written and never sent. Dust motes drifted through the pale shaft of light that fell across the Persian rug, and somewhere in the depths of the house a grandfather clock ticked with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a heart that refused to be rushed. Catherine sat at the desk in a soft gray cashmere jumper, her chestnut hair loose about her shoulders, her hands folded around a cream-colored envelope sealed with a small disc of crimson wax. The wax bore no royal crest, no cipher of the Prince of Wales, no monogram of the palace. Instead, pressed into its still warm surface, was a tiny, careful imprint of a swallow in flight, a private symbol, a childhood emblem, one she had shared with her mother Carol in the gardens of Bucklebury when she was no older than Louis himself. She turned the envelope over slowly in her fingers, tracing the edge of the wax with her thumb, feeling the weight of what she was about to do settle into her chest like a stone lowered into still water. On the desk beside her lay a second document, older, its parchment yellowed at the corners, its typewritten clauses annotated in the crabbed, precise handwriting of a senior courtier long since retired to a quiet manor in Gloucestershire. It was the confidentiality accord, the gag, the paper leash that had bound her tongue for 17 months and 11 days. Across the room, standing by the tall casement window with his back half turned, waited the man who had helped her draft the statement that now lay in her hands. He was not a courtier, he was not a press secretary. He was a producer, one of only 3 people in Britain whom Catherine had personally trusted to help her prepare this moment, and his name would not appear in any bulletin, any newspaper, any official palace communique. His face was pale in the November light, his charcoal suit rumpled from a night without sleep, and his hands, when he lifted them to adjust his glasses, trembled in a way he could not disguise. He had been working since 3 in the morning, coordinating encrypted feeds with a small independent broadcast unit in West London, ensuring that when Catherine's statement was released it would not, could not, be intercepted, delayed, or quietly buried by the palace communications office. Twice already the satellite uplink had wavered. Twice already a call had come through on his private line from a withheld number he had refused to answer. The palace machinery, he knew, had begun to stir. Somewhere in the anonymous offices of a Whitehall building whose address never appeared on any register, the men in grey had woken to the terrifying realization that the Princess of Wales was about to speak, and there was, for the first time in 17 months, nothing they could do to stop her. Catherine drew a long, steadying breath. When she finally lifted her head and looked toward the small camera that had been quietly set up on a tripod in the corner of the room, her eyes, blue and unflinching and rimmed with the soft shadows of too many sleepless nights, held the look of a woman who had at last stopped asking permission. "For 17 months, she said, and her voice was low and graveled with restraint, cracked at the edges with an emotion she no longer bothered to conceal. The world has spoken for my son. The palace has spoken for him. The press has speculated about him. Strangers have written columns about him, therapists have diagnosed him from television studios, and complete unknowns have offered opinions on a little boy they have never met. Today, I am speaking for him, because he asked me to, and because I should have done it a very long time ago. The date she then named, September the 14th, in the year of our Lord 2024, would within hours be circulating on every front page in the English-speaking world. It was the date Prince Louis of Wales, then 6 years old, had been rushed by unmarked car from Adelaide Cottage to a private wing of a London hospital whose name has never been publicly disclosed, struggling to breathe, his small chest heaving, his lips edged with the faintest terrifying tint of blue. It was the date a pediatric respiratory consultant, summoned in the small hours from her home in Chelsea, had used a word Catherine had never before heard spoken about her own child, a word that carried the weight of hospital wards and oxygen masks and long uncertain nights. It was the date the machinery of the Crown had, within 4 hours, drafted the confidentiality accord that Catherine, exhausted, terrified, still in the clothes she had thrown on when Louis first cried out from his bedroom, had signed without reading. And it was the date, she now understood with a cold and terrible clarity, that the men in grey had decided her youngest son's illness would be a state secret. She remembered, even now, the smell of the corridor that night. The particular chemical sharpness of hospital-grade disinfectant, cut through by the faint, incongruous scent of lilies from a vase left on the reception desk by a well-meaning administrator. She remembered the sound of her own footsteps, muffled by the pale grey carpet, and the way William's hand had felt around hers, dry and cold and unnaturally still. She remembered the young doctor with the kind eyes and the nervous stammer who had explained, in the softest possible terms, that Louis had suffered a severe respiratory event triggered by an underlying condition that had gone undiagnosed since infancy, and that while the immediate danger had passed, the road ahead would be long, careful, and deeply private. And she remembered, most of all, the man in the charcoal suit who had arrived at 47 minutes past 3 in the morning, clipboard in hand, polished Oxford shoes making no sound on the linoleum, his cold grey eyes sweeping over the scene with the detached efficiency of a man who had done this many times before. He had introduced himself with a title so vague as to be meaningless, senior advisor to the household, and he had placed the confidentiality accord on the small formica table beside Louis's hospital bed as gently as if he were laying down a christening blanket. "For the boy's protection, ma'am," he had murmured. "For the family's peace, for the stability of the institution." Catherine had signed. William had signed. And in that single, exhausted stroke of a pen, the truth about Prince Louis of Wales had been quietly locked inside a vault that was never meant to be opened. The flashback dissolved as Catherine blinked slowly, her fingers tightening around the envelope in her lap. In the corner of the room, the producer glanced at his watch, then at the small monitor beside the camera, then at her. 9 minutes to broadcast. Somewhere in central London, a duty officer at the Palace Communications Directorate had already been alerted by an anonymous source that something was coming. Somewhere in a private office in Clarence House, a very senior courtier was reaching for a telephone. And somewhere in Norfolk, at Sandringham, an even more senior figure was being gently woken by an aide who did not yet know how to explain what was about to happen. The encrypted feed held, the satellite locked. The nation, though it did not yet know it, was 7 minutes away from the most extraordinary personal statement any senior royal had made in a quarter of a century. Catherine's mind drifted, unbidden, to a summer afternoon in Norfolk 3 years earlier. Long before any of this had begun. It had been August, the sort of golden, drowsy August that only Anmer Hall could produce, when the light through the lime trees turned the lawns to hammered gold and the air smelled of cut grass and distant honeysuckle. Louis, then only 3 years old, had been chasing a small brown swallow across the terrace, his cheeks flushed with laughter, his little Wellington boots leaving damp marks on the flagstones. He had stopped abruptly, breathless, one hand pressed to his chest, and looked up at his mother with an expression she had never quite forgotten. A look of surprise, of confusion, of a child discovering for the first time that his own body could betray him. She had knelt beside him on the warm stone, and he had leaned into her, his small heart hammering against her collarbone, and he had whispered, in the solemn, matter-of-fact way that only very small children can, "Mummy, sometimes the air runs away from me." She had laughed, and kissed the top of his head, and told him that the air would always come back. And she had believed it. God help her, she had believed it. She had not known then, in that golden August, that the air would run away from him again, and again, and again, until one January night it would very nearly not come back at all. The producer cleared his throat softly. 5 minutes. Catherine nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and reached for the second document on the desk, the older one, the one bound in a slim folder of dark green leather embossed with the discreet gold lettering of a private pediatric practice on Harley Street. Inside were the medical reports she had, at last, been given permission to share. Not by the palace, not by the men in gray, but by Louis himself, who 3 weeks earlier, sitting cross-legged on the floor of the nursery with a picture book open in his lap, had looked up at his mother with the same solemn, matter-of-fact gaze he had worn on that terrace at Anmer, and had said quite simply, "Mummy, I don't want people to think we're ashamed of me." The words had struck her, in that moment, with the force of a physical blow. She had knelt on the nursery floor and gathered him into her arms, and held him for what felt like a very long time, her face pressed into the soft warmth of his hair, and she had understood, with a sudden and devastating clarity, what 17 months of silence had done. She had thought she was protecting him. She had thought she was shielding him from the tabloids, from the cruel armchair commentators, from the strangers who would have turned his illness into a spectacle. But in her silence, in her carefully rehearsed non-answers, in the polite deflections at royal engagements, in the way she had let the palace machinery scrub every reference to his condition from official communications, she had accidentally taught her own son that his illness was something to be hidden, something to be ashamed of, something the family could not speak of, even amongst themselves, without the shadow of the men in gray falling across the room. And Louis, her spirited, curious, achingly perceptive little boy, had noticed. Of course he had noticed. Children always notice. That night, after Louis had gone to bed and the house had settled into the low, familiar hum of its evening quiet, Catherine had sat alone in the drawing room and wept. She had wept for the 17 months she had lost. She had wept for the way she had let herself be silenced. She had wept for her son, who had spent nearly a quarter of his short life believing that his mother's love came with a condition of secrecy. And when she had finally stopped weeping, sometime after midnight, she had gone to the writing desk and taken out a single sheet of cream-colored paper, and she had begun to compose the letter that now lay in her lap. 3 minutes. The producer moved quietly to the door and locked it, then returned to the monitor. On the encrypted feed, a small green indicator blinked steadily, confirming that the signal was clean and would deploy the moment Catherine gave her cue. Across London, in an anonymous gray building whose windows had been permanently frosted for reasons of security, a man in a charcoal suit sat at a long mahogany conference table and listened, his knuckles white against the polished wood, as an aide read aloud the fragmentary intelligence that had reached them in the past 40 minutes. The Princess of Wales was preparing a statement. The statement concerned Prince Louis. The statement was going to be released outside the palace communications framework. And there was, the aide concluded with a barely concealed tremor in his voice, no legal instrument they could deploy to stop it. The confidentiality accord Catherine had signed on that January night applied only to disclosures made under the authority of the household. A personal statement, made by a mother, about her own child, in her own voice, from her own home, fell outside the reach of every clause they had so carefully drafted. The man in the charcoal suit set down his cup of tea, its surface trembling faintly, and said nothing for a very long moment. When at last he spoke, his voice was cold and flat and very quiet. "She was never supposed to do this," he said. "She was never supposed to be able to do this. But she was doing it, and she had been able to do it because for 17 months she had watched, and listened, and learned. She had learned that the men in gray were not omnipotent. She had learned that their power depended entirely on the silence of the people they claimed to protect. She had learned that a single mother, speaking a single truth about a single child, could dismantle in 9 minutes what an entire institution had spent nearly 2 years constructing. The rotary telephone on the corner table began, quite suddenly, to ring. It was an old instrument, a heavy bakelite thing with a brass dial. One William had insisted on keeping because it had belonged to his grandmother. Its ring was shrill and antique, and it cut through the quiet of the drawing room like a blade. Catherine looked at it. The producer looked at it. Neither of them moved. It rang 7 times, then 8, then 9, and then it stopped, and in the silence that followed Catherine could hear the faint, distant chime of a grandfather clock striking the quarter hour. 2 minutes, she thought, briefly and painfully, of the phone call she had received on the morning after Louis was first admitted to hospital. It had come from a very senior member of the family, a figure whose voice had always carried the weight of certainty, and whose opinions had shaped the trajectory of the House of Windsor for the better part of a decade. The voice on that morning had been kind, and careful, and unmistakably firm. "You must understand, my dear," the voice had said, "that this is not a private matter. This is a matter of the crown. A little prince's health is not his own, it is the nation's, and the nation must be protected from what it does not need to know." She had listened, she had said yes, she had said of course, she had said thank you, and she had hung up the telephone and sat for a very long time in the pale gray light of that January morning, staring at the wall, understanding for the first time in her 15 years inside the royal family that her children, her own children, were not entirely hers. They belonged, in some cold, unspoken, institutional way, to something older and larger and more ruthless than any love she could ever offer them. She had not spoken of that phone call to anyone. Not to her mother, not to her sister, not even, in any real detail, to William. But she had never forgotten it. And every time, in the 17 months that followed, that she had been tempted to say something publicly, to correct a misleading tabloid rumor, to reassure a concerned member of the public, to simply acknowledge that her son was ill and recovering, that voice had risen in her memory, kind and careful and firm, reminding her that the nation must be protected from what it did not need to know. Until 3 weeks ago. Until a small boy on a nursery floor had looked up from a picture book and told his mother that he did not want people to think the family was ashamed of him.
1 minute.
The producer glanced at Catherine. Catherine nodded. Somewhere across Britain, 23 million people were about to have their morning interrupted. In pubs in Edinburgh that had opened early for the football, pint glasses would soon freeze mid-air. In cafes in Bristol, forkfuls of breakfast would pause halfway to open mouths. In offices in Canary Wharf, keyboards would fall silent. In sitting rooms in Cornwall and Cumbria and the small stone villages of the Yorkshire Dales, the low murmur of morning television would suddenly, without warning, cut to a single image, a woman at a mahogany desk, a cream-colored envelope in her hands, a small crimson wax swallow catching the pale November light. The nation would hold its breath, and the Princess of Wales, at last, would speak. She broke the wax seal. The faint, dry crack of it was, in the hush of the drawing room, the loudest sound she had heard in 17 months. She unfolded the letter with the slow, deliberate care of a woman handling something sacred, and she began, in her own voice, in her own words, to read. "My name is Catherine," she began, "and I am the mother of a 7-year-old boy called Louis. Some of you know him as Prince Louis of Wales. I know him as the little boy who leaves his Wellington boots in the hallway, who insists on jam on both sides of his toast, who cannot yet whistle but is very determined to learn, and who last week told me quite seriously that he intends to become either a knight or a marine biologist, and possibly both. He is my youngest child. He is his brother's shadow and his sister's protector. He is loved beyond measure. And he has been unwell." Her voice caught, very briefly on the last word, but she did not stop. She did not look up from the page. She simply drew a breath and continued. "In September of last year, Louis was diagnosed with a serious respiratory condition. I will not name the condition here, because Louis has asked that I not name it, and because he is old enough now to have opinions about what belongs to him and what belongs to the world. He is entitled to that boundary. What I will say is this. He has spent the past 14 months in the care of a remarkable team of doctors, nurses, physiotherapists and specialists whose names the public will never know, but whose faces my son sees every week, and whose kindness has, quite literally, saved his life. Across Britain, in 23 million homes, something extraordinary was happening. People were, quite suddenly, and quite without meaning to, beginning to cry. Not the theatrical tears of tabloid consumption, not the performative weeping of celebrity grief, but the small, quiet, private tears of ordinary people who had, for reasons they could not entirely articulate, spent 17 months worrying about a little boy they had never met, and who were now, at last, being told the truth. "There have been nights," Catherine continued, her voice steadier now, gathering strength as it went, "when I have sat by my son's bed and listened to him breathe, and I have counted every breath, because I did not know whether the next one would come. There have been mornings when I have watched him sleep and been unable to look away, because I could not quite believe that he was still here. There have been afternoons when I have smiled at cameras and shaken hands at engagements while my child was, at that very moment, undergoing procedures whose names I still cannot pronounce. I tell you this not because I want your sympathy. I tell you this because I want you to understand what silence costs, what it costs a mother, what it costs a marriage, and what, most importantly, it costs a little boy who has begun to wonder why his family cannot speak his name in public without a pause." She paused herself then, but only for the briefest of moments, and when she resumed her voice had changed. It had hardened, not with anger but with something colder and clearer, a resolve that had been 17 months in the forging. "3 weeks ago my son asked me a question. He asked me whether we were ashamed of him. I want to be very clear, to him and to every child watching this who has ever been quietly hidden by the people who love them for reasons that felt, at the time, like protection. We are not ashamed of you. We have never been ashamed of you. And if our silence has ever, even for a single afternoon, made you believe otherwise, then that silence was a mistake, and I am here today to correct it." In the anonymous grey building in central London, the man in the charcoal suit closed his eyes. He did not speak. He did not move. The aide beside him, a younger man whose career had been built entirely on the discipline of institutional silence, looked as though he might be about to be physically ill. On the long mahogany conference table a red telephone had begun to ring, and no one had yet found the courage to answer it. The machinery of the crown, that vast, ancient, ruthless apparatus that had swallowed reputations and rewritten histories and buried inconvenient truths since the reign of the Stuart kings, had at last encountered a force it could not entirely absorb. A mother, speaking about her child. In her own voice, the letter continued. Catherine read the passage in which Louis, in his own words transcribed carefully by his mother from a conversation the two of them had held on the nursery floor 11 days earlier, thanked the medical team who had cared for him. He thanked them by name, first names only, because that was how he knew them. He thanked Nurse Amy, who had let him name the drip stand Reginald. He thanked Dr. Priya, who had drawn dinosaurs on the corner of every consent form. He thanked the physiotherapist, whose name he could not quite pronounce but whom he referred to, with grave 7-year-old dignity, as the man with the kind hands. He thanked his brother George, who had read to him every evening for 142 consecutive nights during the worst of it, and who had at one particularly frightening moment climbed into his hospital bed fully clothed and simply held him until he fell asleep. He thanked his sister Charlotte, who had drawn him a picture every single day and delivered them by hand, and who had once, when he had been too weak to lift a cup of water, held it patiently to his lips for the better part of an hour. He thanked his father, who had cried in front of him for the first time in his short life, and who had told him afterwards that crying in front of the people you love is not weakness but the opposite of it. And he thanked his mother, who had taught him, over the course of a very long year, that being brave did not mean being unafraid. It meant being afraid, and doing the thing anyway. Somewhere in Kensington Palace, in a private study whose windows looked out onto a garden gone brown with the first hard frost of November, the Prince of Wales stood alone before a small television and watched his wife read their son's words, and for perhaps the third time in his adult life he wept openly, without shame, without concealment, without any of the aristocratic composure that had been drilled into him since the age of 4. He did not attempt to stop the tears, he did not turn away from the screen. He simply stood, his hands loose at his sides, and let his son's gratitude wash over him like water over stone. The rotary telephone in the drawing room began, once again, to ring. Catherine did not look at it, the producer did not move. It rang, and eventually the answering machine, an old cassette-based instrument that Catherine had never quite got round to replacing, clicked on. The voice that filled the room was hoarse, unsteady, and unmistakably that of a man who had been crying. "Kath," it said, and then it broke, and then it tried again. "Kath, keep going, don't stop, I'm here, I'm right here, keep going." It was William. She did not turn her head, she did not need to. She simply drew another breath and continued to read. The letter now turned, as she had known it must, to the harder ground. She did not name the man in the charcoal suit. She did not name the senior figure whose kind, careful, firm voice had told her on that January morning that the nation must be protected from what it did not need to know. She did not name the anonymous grey building in central London, but she named the pattern, she named the practice, she named in careful and unflinching prose the institutional habit of using the language of protection to justify the fact of silence. "There is a difference," she read, "between privacy and secrecy. Privacy is a gift a family gives itself. Secrecy is a cage another party builds around it. My family was entitled to privacy. My son was entitled to privacy. But what we were given, over the past 17 months, was not privacy. It was silence. It was a silence that we did not choose, and that we were told, again and again, was for our own good. It was not for our own good. It was for the good of an institution that has grown so accustomed to controlling the narrative of every royal life that it has forgotten how to distinguish between protecting a child and possessing one." The words hung in the drawing room like the last note of a struck bell. In pubs across Edinburgh, pint glasses had indeed frozen mid-air, and would remain there for the better part of a minute. In sitting rooms in Cornwall, hands had reached instinctively across sofas to hold other hands. In a small stone cottage on the edge of the Yorkshire Dales, an elderly woman who had lived through the reign of 4 monarchs simply set down her teacup, folded her hands in her lap, and said, very softly, to no one in particular, "About time." Catherine turned the page. There was one more passage. It was the passage she had rewritten 7 times. It was the passage William had begged her, 3 nights earlier, not to soften. And it was the passage that would, within an hour, be quoted on every front page in the English-speaking world. "I want to say, finally, something to the people whose job it has been, for the past 17 months, to keep my son's illness from the public. I understand that many of you believed you were doing your duty. I understand that some of you have served this family for a very long time, and that you have watched other royal children grow up under the weight of expectations that no child should have to bear. I understand that you have seen in your own careers what unfiltered public attention can do to a young life. I do not doubt that some of you acted from a place that felt to you like care. But I want you to hear me now, because I will not say this again. My children are not the property of the institution. They are not assets to be managed. They are not narratives to be controlled. They are children. They belong to their family. And when the institution's instinct to protect itself comes into conflict with a child's need to be seen, to be spoken of, to be loved openly and without shame, the institution must yield. Not the child. Never the child. She folded the letter. She placed it, with great care, on the mahogany desk. She looked, for the first time in nearly 9 minutes, directly into the camera. Her eyes were wet, her hands were steady, and when she spoke her final words, she spoke them not as a princess, not as a duchess, not as a future queen consort, but as a mother, and only as a mother. "Louis is doing well," she said. "He is going to be all right. He wanted you to know. That is all. Thank you." The camera held on her for perhaps 3 seconds longer than it needed to. Then, cleanly, without music, without commentary, without the reassuring intervention of any presenter or anchor, the feed cut to black. Across Britain, a silence descended that was, in its own way, more extraordinary than any noise the nation could have made. It was the silence of 23 million people simultaneously absorbing something they had not quite been prepared to feel. It was the silence of a country that had, for reasons it had not fully understood, been holding a small collective breath for 17 months, and was now, at last, being allowed to let it go. In the studios of every major broadcaster in London, presenters sat momentarily speechless before their cameras, their earpieces flooded with the frantic voices of producers who did not know what to say next. On social media, for perhaps the first time in the history of the platform, the noise died down rather than rising up. People simply sat, and thought, and, in very many cases, wept. In the anonymous grey building in central London, the man in the charcoal suit rose slowly from the long mahogany conference table. He did not speak. He did not look at his aide. He simply gathered his papers, folded them into his leather portfolio, and walked to the door. At the threshold he paused, one hand on the brass handle, and for a moment he seemed almost to sway on his polished Oxford shoes. Then he straightened, adjusted his tie, and left the room. He would retire, quietly and without fanfare, within the month. His name would never appear in any newspaper. His role would never be publicly acknowledged, but the machinery he had helped to run for the better part of 3 decades had, in the space of 9 minutes, been fundamentally and permanently altered. The men in grey had lost, not because they had been defeated in any dramatic confrontation, but because a mother had at last refused to remain silent about her child. In Adelaide Cottage, Catherine sat for a long moment at the mahogany desk. The producer, without a word, began quietly to pack away the camera and the small monitor. The encrypted feed was closed. The satellite uplink released. The letter lay folded on the desk, its crimson swallow catching the last of the pale November light. Catherine reached out and touched the wax seal, very gently, with the tip of her finger. She thought of the terrace at Anmere Hall, and the small brown swallow, and a 3-year-old boy who had told her, quite solemnly, that sometimes the air ran away from him. She thought of the January hospital corridor, and the smell of lilies, and the kind young doctor with the nervous stammer. She thought of the nursery floor, and the picture book, and the 7-year-old boy who had asked her whether the family was ashamed of him. And she thought, at last, of the small, patient, unshakable love that had brought her, over the course of 17 months and 11 days, to this quiet drawing-room, and this cream-colored letter, and this single, imperfect, necessary act of speech. The door opened. William stood in the doorway. He was still in the clothes he had been wearing at breakfast, his hair unkempt, his eyes red-rimmed. He did not speak. He simply crossed the room, knelt beside her chair, and put his arms around her. She turned her face into his shoulder, and let herself, for the first time in a very long time, be held without any part of her having to remain on duty. Upstairs in the nursery, a small boy in blue pajamas was sitting cross-legged on the floor with a picture book open in his lap. His older brother sat beside him, one arm draped protectively across his shoulders. His older sister sat on the other side, her small hand resting on his knee. On the television in the corner of the room, tuned quietly to a children's channel by the nanny who understood exactly what the day required, a cartoon rabbit was learning to be brave. Louis did not know, in any detailed sense, what his mother had just done. He knew only that she had told him, that morning at breakfast, that she was going to say his name out loud where everyone could hear it, and that he did not have to be afraid, because being afraid and doing the thing anyway was what being brave meant. He had nodded, very seriously, and eaten his toast, and gone upstairs to play. Now, as the November light shifted across the nursery carpet and his brother turned the page of the picture book, he leaned his head against George's shoulder and, without quite knowing why, smiled. Downstairs, in the drawing room, Catherine at last drew back from William's embrace. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and no words were exchanged because no words were necessary. She took the letter from the desk, walked to the fireplace, and placed it, together with the older document, the confidentiality accord, the paper leash, into the small brass box on the mantelpiece where the family kept its most private correspondence. She closed the lid. She turned the tiny key, and she slipped the key into the pocket of her cashmere jumper, where it would remain for the rest of the day, a small warm weight against her hip. Outside, the November wind moved through the oaks of Windsor Great Park. Inside, the grandfather clock ticked steadily on. The nation, in its 23 million homes, began, slowly and cautiously and with a great deal of quiet feeling, to speak again. Newspapers scrambled, broadcasters recovered, analysts theorized. But none of that, in the drawing room of Adelaide Cottage, mattered very much. What mattered was that a small boy upstairs was leaning against his brother's shoulder and smiling. What mattered was that a mother had at last stopped being afraid of the men in gray. What mattered was that the swallow, pressed in crimson wax onto a cream-colored envelope, had finally flown free. The truth had saved her boy, and in the quiet drawing room of a Berkshire cottage, on a pale November morning that would be remembered for a very long time, the Princess of Wales stood at the mantelpiece with her hand resting lightly against the small brass box, and she listened, at last, to the sound of her own family breathing.